O'clock. I'm Phyllis Kiorat, and I'm really grateful to all of you who are with me this evening for a very important talk, certainly for me, and I think in the context of the times that we are now living in. It is, I called it the roots of pagan resistance, finding strength in a time of tyranny. It could be reversed and be finding strength in a time of tyranny, the roots of pagan resistance. And I really appreciate that you're here with me tonight. It's a big topic that I have deep roots set in, that I've been contemplating and reading about, thinking about, and talking about publicly since way back in 2004, 2005, 2006. I gave a series of talks around the country at lots of pagan and Wiccan and witch gatherings on the growing threat of American fascism, what it looked like, how to recognize it, what the sources of it or what the history of it was. And I focused a lot at that time on theocracy and the evangelical movement and its intertwining with the political movement, and how they were feeding off of each other and using each other for their own intertwined ends, and in hoping to sort of wake people up. And now, I hate to say it, but this is the curse of being a Cassandra 16 years later. A lot of what I was talking about then has now blossomed. It's gone from dangerous seed to poisonous fruit. So I want to talk about what tyranny is, what it looks like, so we recognize it. And hi, Chris. And most importantly, how we contend with its effects on us as individuals, the damage it does to soul and to psyche and to our lives, what the damage it does to society, to culture, and how we respond to that with vigor, with strength, with courage, with the kinds of values and activism that can turn a dark situation into a very different one. So hi, Therese. Good to see you again. Thank you for joining me. So, as usual, I'm going to say hi to everybody at the beginning. Hi, Richie. Thank you for joining me again. Hi. Who else is here? I'm very glad that you're joining me tonight. So a very important thing to do first, aside from saying hi to everybody and welcoming you and expressing my gratitude, my sincere gratitude that you're here with me, is to return to the topic that we talked about a month ago, which was Australia, and what we could do to be of assistance. Hi, Cora. Hello in the Netherlands. It's so wonderful that you're here every month. It makes me very happy. And Melody. Hi, Melody Sharp. Since a month ago, there have been a number of rains that helped to put out some fires, which is a good thing, but rains can also be a source of great risk now, because so much of the ground cover and the forestation is gone and been washed away. So it's a double-edged sword, which is one reason we talked about not doing weather magic. But those rains did in fact put out about 34 fires, as I recall that number. Might be wrong, but in that neighborhood. Hopefully more in positive ways and helpful ways, as opposed to ways that compound the damage. And people are continuing to struggle. There are continuing fires, and there's tremendous damage and enormous efforts that are being undertaken by Australians and by people around the world who are trying to help in various ways. Hi, Joanne from Vancouver, BC. Hi, Ellie. Hi. So I just wanted to remind folks that if you hadn't, hi, Putuo Shan, forgive me if I have not pronounced that properly. Thank you for joining us. Take a look at the article on The Wild Hunt, which you'll find online, by Josephine Winter. She is a co-creator of the Pagan Collective of Victoria in Australia, and wrote a very good piece in the midst of this cataclysm in Australia. And at the end of it are a long list of links that people can go to in order to provide assistance, primarily financial, but you can also then go to their sites and see the other ways in which they're asking for help. So there's fire relief for the First Nations communities, for the Aboriginal communities, for volunteer firefighters. There's quite a number of listings for wildlife rescue. I personally made a donation to Save 'em, which is a group of South Australian vets who are working to save the animal populations of the very devastated Kangaroo Island. They don't have any external funding, and so they're relying on donations. And so that's where I wanted to make my contribution. And then there are a number of sites for general bushfire relief. The good thing is that in terms of coverage is that the news has continued to cover this story with a lot of focusing on the things that are being done to help the animals. One of the things that Josephine talked about was the knitting campaigns that a lot of pagans had undertaken to knit pouches for all of the various marsupials and mittens for the animals whose feet were burned. It breaks my heart every time I see one of these heartbreaking images, but it also gives me a sense of hope that there are so many wonderful people who are doing everything they can to remedy this terrible damage. Hi, Paula, Odom, good to see you. So tonight I want to talk about tyranny. I may find myself using the term fascism because that was a term that I grew up with, and it was a sort of a generic term. I know that in the interim since the Second World War, there've been a tremendous number of smart and academic papers and a lot of thinking on the use of that particular term, which is sort of culturally specific to Italy and what was happening in Italy. In my upbringing, it was used in a sort of more generic term to refer to authoritarianism or tyranny, and so I may indeed slip into the use of that term, and I'm using it in a broader context rather than in its specific cultural expression. So I'm going to try to use the term tyranny, but if I slip into it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Tonight, I made myself an outline because it's such... it's not that it's a complicated subject, although it has its complexities, but there's so much that can be said about it and should be said about it that I wanted to keep track of my time so that I can at least say something about each of these essential points. And if it seems that there's enough interest, then I would consider approaching the subject again and sort of looking in greater depth into one of these specific points in the conversation. So to give you just an overview of what I'm hoping to do is to explain to you my own perspective as I approach the subject, a kind of personal reflection on my family and my background, my proximity, given my age. Hi. Is it Dan? Hi, Dan. To the Nazism and the fascism and of the Second World War. I was born after that, but it had tremendous cultural resonance for me as a child and not so much as an adolescent. But it was a very potent and proximate event. And I wanted to talk just very briefly about what I call the Cassandra curse, which is this capacity to sort of see down the road to what is coming. And that lecture series that I did in 2004. And if anybody happens to see this particular Facebook Live and hears about it, and you have a copy of it, because a number of the talks were recorded, and I don't have those recordings. If you have them, let me know. Maybe there's a way of updating the technology and getting me a copy, because I'm certainly interested in seeing that now and putting it up on the YouTube page. I want to talk at a little bit greater length about the characteristics of tyranny. There's been some terrific work, including by Umberto Eco, the author of The Name of the Rose, brilliant, more about fascism, but but in the broader framework of what we have to deal with these days, and what Europe what the whole world had to deal with 70, I can't believe 70 years ago. Yeah, 80 years ago. And in particular, the work of a very brilliant guy, Dr. Lawrence Britt, who basically looked at the fascist regimes of Hitler and Mussolini, and also in Indonesia under Suharto, and in Latin American regimes, and came up with essentially sort of 14 identifying characteristics. I'm not going to take as much time in talking about that as I'd like to, because it would take up the whole hour, but I'm going to touch on those. And in that conversation, I think you're going to recognize a lot of what's happening right now. And then I want to talk briefly about the effect that tyranny and authoritarianism has upon us as individuals, on our psyches, our souls, and the society in which we live. And then I want to talk about the antidote to that. What is the therapy? What's the remedy? And the idea that democracy is not a spectator sport, but is in fact a kind of therapy and remedy. But we have to act in accord. Then I want to talk briefly about magic, and the very important awakening to the fact that we're not just fighting against something, we are fighting for something. And what is it that we're fighting for? And how what we are fighting for is a source of solutions and values and sustenance and strength and inspiration, guidance, healing, and all the things that we need to be engaged proactively at a time of crisis that can seem enormously disempowering and depressing and overwhelming. In fact, and particularly as pagans and as witches, practitioners of indigenous traditions and indigenous revivals, we have tremendous sources of encouragement. And so I will probably share a couple of, I think a few inspiring stories, if there's time. I want to talk a little bit about Aradia, the name that I took when I was initiated 40 years ago, and Robin Hood, and perhaps the story of the crone and the king, maybe a little bit about Sitting Bull from the indigenous traditions of America, and then circle back to what we are fighting for, and the wisdom that we derive from our relationship with Mother Earth and the sustenance that she provides to us and the guidance. And as I often do these days, with this sort of key practice that connects us to the divinity that's just a breath away, and that can sustain us through a difficult time. So that's my plan for the evening. And I'm very grateful to all of you. Hi, Mimi. Yes. So what do we got? Beneficial. Yes, Timothy Snyder, exactly right here. Who's going to hold it up at the very good. It's a quick and easy and nourishing kind of read. Rachel Maddow is a big advocate of this little book. You can read it in less than an evening. And it's both lessons from the 20th century, but it's very oriented towards providing guidance in how one recognizes and copes with this dynamic, and some very sensible things, which I won't repeat. I'll just refer you to this. So thanks, maybe that's really helpful. So, okay. So a little bit about me. I come from my parents were, hi Jill. Both of my parents were social justice activists in the 1930s. My father was a union organizer, one of the founders of the National Maritime Union, during a period when it wasn't quite as bad as the 1919s and 1920s, when there was tremendous violence, but there was still huge violence against the unionization of workers in this country. And so that's where his roots were. Hi, Amaze. Is it Amaze? I hope that's pronounced right. And Wendy, hi. One of the first songs that he taught me was, there once was a union maid who never was afraid of goons and ginks and company finks. And this is what she'd say. No, you can't scare me. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die. Old song. and I got that along with the nursery rhymes. My mother came from a Jewish family, a well-to-do Jewish family in New York, and therefore was somebody who grew up in the midst of a very active, socially present anti-Semitism in the United States, and certainly rising in Europe and informing Nazism and fascism in Germany and in Italy, and then around the world. Hi, Cindy. So I grew up, they were humanists. I wasn't raised with a religion, but I was raised with an acute sensitivity to anti-Semitism and a highly refined radar. And as a child also, I was born in 1954. Amazing. I cannot believe it. Just turned 66. I can't believe that. But the end of the Second World War happened 9 years before my birth. And by the time, I started to develop some awareness of the world around me, 6, 7, 8 years old, it was still very present in the culture, in documentaries, in movies, on television, in conversations, in literature, even in newsprint. It was still a very powerful, resonating current. And it had been defeated. And there was a great sense of a cultural zeitgeist, of freedom, of the Enlightenment returning, of liberal democracy. And that was what the United States was in pursuit of, helping to seed and cultivate. Despite all the contradictions, and there are plenty, that commitment to a world culture of freedom. And yes, I understand that there were quite a number of contradictions to that, including in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the so-called Red Scare and the witch hunts in this country, which were the exact opposite of a liberal, enlightened democracy. But despite the contradictions, overall, there was this feeling that we had overcome one of the greatest nightmares, one of the greatest darknesses to befall humanity, and that we had beaten it back, and that we had beaten it back by maintaining our moral compass. That was an absolutely essential part of the accomplishment of this victory. The Nuremberg trials are an example of that. Interestingly enough, Steyer, one of the candidates, his father was one of the prosecutors in the Nuremberg trials. So the idea that we practiced what we preached, and that after the fact we were committed to justice. Hi, Jamie. I can't see people. I can see little tiny pictures of you with your names. That's it. So that enormous event that had completely catalyzed and engaged this country, that had helped to pull it out of the Depression, and to which everybody in this country was committed, except, of course, there were in fact Nazis, there were fascists, there was an extreme right wing, there were supporters of Nazi Germany who opposed our getting into the Second World War and delayed it. There was a very strong current of that. Donald Trump's father was part of a very right-wing group that supported the KKK, etc., that people need to pay a little more attention to. But even Joe Kennedy was a supporter of had business ties over in Nazi Germany, and was one of the loudest voices against the United States getting involved in the Second World War. Had we not gotten involved, we would be living in a very different world right now. So all of that was quite, I was a child, but it was still a very powerful current, and certainly something that I was made aware of by my parents, who my father had served. He was a lieutenant in the Navy, and then volunteered and was part of the Merchant Marine, which was a very dangerous service. Hi, Heather. And my mother, like many other women, was part of the workforce and part of the massive undertaking by everybody who lived here in the United States. And she would tell me stories about how all sorts of antiques and things that my grandmother, my mother's mother, had were donated to turn into bullets and armaments for the war effort, and the victory gardens that people had, and how women kept fat in cans which they brought down. I mean, I heard these stories, so there was an awareness. That certainly sensitized me as an individual. And I myself began my career as a lawyer, as a social justice activist, fighting organized crime and trade unions. And I was politically sensitive and politically aware, and could look at America and see its contradictions, see the racism, see the sexism. I was part of that second wave feminism. And I was aware that things are not perfect, right? That there were ideals that this country didn't fully live up to. But as Martin Luther King said, I also saw that the arc of justice, though bending slowly, always, the arc of history, though bending slowly, bent towards justice. That was the history of our country, that gradually, slowly, step by step, that we put an end to child labor, that we put an end to serfdom, that we put an end to people working 6-7 days a week for no wages in dangerous conditions, that people were allowed to organize and form trade unions, that we had a First Amendment. And in fact, I began my career in fighting organized crime and trade unions. I was a kind of civil liberties lawyer within the trade union movement, fighting for the rights, to have free elections, to be able to speak freely, to organize in order to overcome corrupt leadership and criminal leadership. So that was, that was me. And so it wasn't a surprise that I took the name of Aradia. Literally on the night of my initiation, the book fell off the shelf, and I opened it randomly, and there was a small biography, brief, of a female figure named Aradia. So maybe I'll tell the story now. I'll weave it in. And she was like a female Robin Hood in Italy. Did she exist? We still don't know. There's been some research. She may have been a mythological figure, an apocryphal figure, like Robin Hood. Did she exist, or was she fictional? We don't know. But she was supposedly born in the early 1300s, grew up in Volterra, Italy, and her aunt was a practitioner of La Vecchia Religione, the old religion. And so she learned the old religion, the goddess of Diana. And Diana is a very ancient goddess in what is now known as Italy. And not to go at great length, but she was a central figure, the divine goddess of healing. And she had a healing center at Lake Nemi outside of Rome. And it was a separate culture from the Roman culture. And it survived into the Roman era, which was a very male warrior-based pagan, but very, patriarchal culture. But the healing center of Diana, which had expanded over several thousand years into a large healing center, provided healing for all people, whether they were slaves or runaway slaves or serfs or servants or nobility. All came and all received healing at her temples, at her healing centers. And they also healed animals as well. So it was sort of your first public health program. And the goddess Diana was, from the earliest times in Italy, seen as the protector of the poor, of the disadvantaged, of the enslaved, of those who suffered and struggled. And so it wasn't a surprise that it was that religion that continued on, practiced largely by the Pagani, by the people of the countryside, outside of the city centers. They continued to worship the goddess Diana, and she was said to be the goddess of the witches, and it was to her that Aradia was devoted as a priestess, as her witch, as her servant, and the myth grew up that she led the serfs and slaves, which people don't realize that in the 1300s, and not just in Italy, but around all around Europe, there were in fact slaves. And she led them in revolt against the nobility and against the church. The nobility was largely Catholicized and was in alliance with the church. And there were throughout all of Europe during the time, in Germany, everywhere, there were serf rebellions. And in England, there's a longer discussion about what was happening, but they were being thrown off lands that they'd held and that they'd farmed for hundreds of years. The land was being seized by the noble class, and people were essentially being thrown into serfdom and slavery to till the land without deriving the benefit of it. And they were enslaved. That's a very short synopsis. And so Aradia was a figure who led the rebellions and against the nobility, and practiced the old religion, and practiced with these rebelling slaves and serfs and peasants. And she disappears at one. They're in the Alban Hills, which is outside of Rome, and she's leading the rebellion. And she sends them off into throughout. They scatter throughout Italy in order to survive, and she disappears. Part of the story is that perhaps she was imprisoned for a while and then she broke free, but she disappears. So there was this biography on the night of my initiation. I looked at it and I said, that's me. So I took that name. And don't usually talk about it, but this seemed like the appropriate time. So we have within our own history these marvelous stories. And in fact, the very fact that we describe her as a female Robin Hood, there is the story of Robin Hood in England, who similarly led the people in rebellion against evil lords and nobility who were stealing the land and oppressing the peoples. And these stories are a part of our culture as people reviving the indigenous earth-based religious traditions that preceded Christianity and the nobility. So I have been aware and sensitized. And in 2004, there was an acceleration. It was a consequence, I think, of the re-election of George Bush and the alliance that the Republican Party had been making over quite a number of years with the evangelical movement, the Christian right, in order to secure the vote and get elected. Thank you, Robin. I was happy to do it. Thanks. And if you didn't live through it, you won't remember. So, there's a book called American Theocracy, very good. But there was this unholy alliance that was being woven, committed to between the evangelical Christian right and the Republican Party. And in that process, the Republican Party moved further right, not just on economic issues that were to the advantage of a ruling class of the 1% that Bernie talks about with so much passion, quite correctly. But within the it became the sort of overarching driving force within the Republican Party, and helped move the Republican Party further to right on social issues, not just economic, but social issues. So abortion and women's rights and gay rights, etc. And a complete indifference to the state of the environment, because in evangelical Christians, the world is going to be destroyed anyway when Christ returns, and everybody goes, not everybody, but 140,000 people who, are fervent in their evangelical commitment, and they get to go to heaven with Jesus. And so we don't need to worry about the state of the planet, because we don't care about the state of the planet. And that was a very potent, very visible, increasingly enunciated impulse in the culture after his election and re-election. And that influence in the Republican Party was quite visceral and very visible. And we started to see also a tremendous amount of money that was being put into establishing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, others that could cultivate a initially very conservative ideology and social policy and economic policy, and could have influence equal to, if not greater than, what was seen as an essentially liberal media and liberal educational system, etc. And it gained increasing power and potency. And during this period also we had Lee Atwater, his student Karl Rove, the dirty tricks that grew out of the Nixon administration and that then carried forward through the Republican Party, including Father Bush. So there's a dark history of dirty tricks, of Roger Stone, who was an apprentice of Lee Atwater, and of Roy Cohn. When you hear Donald Trump talking about Roy Cohn, where's my Roy Cohn? Roy Cohn was the lawyer to the House Un-American Activities Committee and to McCarthy, who was the crazy senator who was the firebrand behind the witch hunts in the United States during the 1940s and 1950s. And Roy Cohn was the attorney, very corrupt guy, and a very dear friend of Donald Trump's and a tutor of Roger Stone. So there is this kind of continuity that we find, and the characters repeating and the roles repeating as we move forward in the post-war America. The other thing that started during this period, along with the dirty tricks and the shift to the right, and the vocabulary, as this effort was made, they got very, very smart about. I mean, they've always been better at the game of politics, I think, than the Democrats. Yes, Natalie, it's something, but it's important to know. You have to know the history, and you have to recognize, right? You cannot banish something if you don't know what it is you're banishing, right? If you're not ready to face it, you're not going to be able to contend with it. So that's part of why I'm doing this, to give you this perspective, not to overwhelm you, but to arm you, because information is power. And if you don't know, then you don't know who you're fighting, and you don't know how to fight them. One of the strategies that was developed during this period, aside from a whole vocabulary, I'm forgetting his name now. He was part of the move in the House in the 1980s. His name will come back to me. He's now on Fox all the time. He was a congressman, and he led that sort of young rebellion of all these neoconservatives. Anyway, and the idea was to bring a gun to what had been an argument. Right? You don't bring a knife to a gunfight. They started bringing guns to a debate. And the development of the vocabulary, where liberal was a dirty word, and it got right. And we remember how aggressive it was. Rush Limbaugh and all of these articulators of hate. And then you had the development of Fox News, which is Newt Gingrich. Thank you, Robin. Exactly, Newt Gingrich. And if you didn't live through it, then it may not resonate for you. But those of us who lived through it, it was horrifying to see the way in which what had once been political discourse and argumentation, which led ultimately to compromise, right? That you take this poll and this poll, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, and in order to get things done, they had to talk, they had to engage, they had to compromise, they had to come to a conclusion together, draft legislation, and move forward. And that was essentially how our government worked until Newt Gingrich and the politics of confrontation and refusal, which is what Mitch McConnell is doing now. This absolute refusal. I will not let any judges pass. We will not pass any legislation. It began right with Barack Obama. What was the first thing he said on the day he was elected? Nothing will pass. Nothing will pass. And nothing passed. At least as long as there was Republican control. So instead of the old model of conversation and compromise, which is in fact the way nature works, male, female, You put them together, they create a new life form. Opposites, they come together, they interact, and out of their interaction, something new emerges. It's a dialectical process that nature uses for evolution, and it's how this government was intended to work, and it has not been working. And one reason it hasn't been working is because of what I was calling for many years the Republican strategy of polite fascism, because that's what it was. It was the Republican Party's one-party strategy. And there were position papers, and it came out of the Heritage Foundations, and it wasn't getting wide dissemination or coverage. People weren't talking about it, but it was, in fact, the strategy that was informing their politics and how they approached politics and how this breakdown accelerated, how it was provoked and how it was accelerated. Now, the Democrats played their role in their passivity and acting like abused wives and capitulation, et cetera. And Bill Clinton signed a lot of bad legislation. So, which you'll find people talking about now in the Democratic debates. But at any rate, so what we had was this sort of prolonged 30, 40-year strategy of establishing a one-party rule. And the Republicans were brilliant in effectuating it. It began at local levels, in taking over school boards and state legislatures, and then gerrymandering, which is one reason that we are looking at Donald Trump. That the popular vote has now twice, with Gore and with Clinton, gone to Democratic candidates. But the Electoral College, because of the way in which the votes are structured, the Electoral College ends up going to the Republicans. And gerrymandering has an enormous contribution to this. It's one reason that it's been so difficult to get back control of the Senate in a democratically elected way. And there's a lot more to talk about in terms of limiting access to the vote and getting rid of the Voters' Rights Act and how Native Americans have been treated in their vote and peoples of color and the suppression of the vote. But we don't have time to go into all of that tonight. But this polite fascism of the Republican strategy of one-party rule essentially has laid the foundation for what we are now experiencing. I think the Republicans just didn't expect that it was going to be Donald Trump. They thought it would be someone more in keeping with the old line Republican Guard. And instead they got Donald Trump, and we got Donald Trump in the process. So the characteristics of tyranny. The work of Lawrence Britt then became the foundation for the talks that I was giving in 2004, 2005, 2006, when I was like banging on the bell and trying to wake people up and get them to pay attention to this alliance, this unholy alliance between the evangelicals whose social policies are in direct contravention to the perspective of most women and in a liberal society, and certainly to pagans and witches and practitioners of indigenous and indigenous revivals. So I was drawing a lot on his work, and it has made a resurface now. People are starting to talk about it. And there's a lot of wonderful research on this, but I find his work to be particularly useful, and you'll find it if you go online. It's generally referred to as the 14 defining characteristics of fascism, because that was what he was looking at. And as I said, he was looking at Germany, Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy, and he was looking at authoritarianism under Suharto in Indonesia and at other, and specifically in a number of Latin American regimes. Now he could look at Turkey. The list is growing, and this is one of the things that makes it something that is really demanding of our attention, because it's not just here in the United States. What they're calling it nationalism, but it is in fact a totalitarianism that is starting to spread around the world, and in which totalitarian leaders are engaged in mutual support. And one of the criticisms that even John Bolton, who is such a conservative, was concerned about with Trump has been his support for tyrants all over the world, his fascination and more importantly, his support of them. So Dr. Lawrence Britt is the drafter of these, and I'll just go through them very quickly. These are the identifying characteristics of what he called fascism, what we would now, in a more general term, refer to as tyranny. The first is a powerful and continuing nationalism. So when you hear that word, it should be a warning bell when people refer to themselves as nationalists. It is one of the things that it's a flag that you're looking at authoritarianism. And there's patriotism, which we all have for our country, but this is more than that. It's characterized by a constant use of patriotic mottos and slogans and symbols and paraphernalia and songs, and the flags are everywhere, on symbols and clothing and public displays. You see Trump hugging the flag. So you start to see this everywhere, and with that, of course, goes you can't burn. In the 60s, that you couldn't burn the flag, that you can't use the flag in protest, etc. There's more than that. It's an appropriation of the symbol of the country, of the flag or whatever it is. And then there are these patriotic mottos. When they created the Homeland Security and they started to refer to the homeland, my skin crawled. That very phrase is a fascist phrase, and came out of the Bush administration, of course. And so when you hear that, the homeland, and in Germany they're referring to it as the fatherland, but it has this resonance because of that its roots are in this fatherland. The second, and I don't know that these are necessarily in the order, of importance. This is simply the order in which he put them, which is this real outspoken disdain for human rights. And this is, we see this now, separating children from their parents when they come across the borders and putting them in cages, is probably the most vivid and violent and explicit example of this kind of disdain for human rights. And because of it, so he says, because of a fear of enemies and the need for security, people in fascist regimes are persuaded that human rights can be ignored because of need. And of course, this took place after 9/11 and the use of torture and the legitimization of the use of torture by the United States, which is forbidden by the Geneva Convention and something that this country eschewed. And that people look away, and that people justify and look away and accept it as legitimate or necessary. But it begins to set the stage for a fundamental corruption of the basic values of democracy and enlightenment. And so we went through that after 9/11, and it left it corroded and eroded a fundamental integrity of the American character, which we now see being further eroded, and in a certain sense could be said to have laid a groundwork for the election of someone like Donald Trump. The identification of enemies or scapegoats as a unifying cause. And of course, this is what is done at all of the rallies that the president has, that people are literally rallied into a unifying frenzy, a pseudo-patriotic frenzy over the need to eliminate a perceived common threat or foe, racial, ethnic, religious minorities, right? During the Nazi nightmare, it was directed against Jews and the Roma and gay people, etc., and communists, etc., principally against Jews. Liberals, communists, socialists, terrorists, and we still have that use of the word communist and socialist in this country, as a way of fear-mongering. Number 4 was the supremacy of the military. So that even when there are these widespread domestic problems, the military is given a disproportionate amount of government funding, and the domestic agenda is neglected. Soldiers and military service are glamorized. And we see that tribalism, we'll get there. Yeah, tribalism as this idea of the identification of enemies and scapegoats. Yes, Natalie, exactly. And so you see with Trump that on the one hand, he's trying to withdraw us from from Syria and from Afghanistan and places like that. And at the same time, he's hyping the military. He's simultaneously failing to provide necessary care. He's taking money out of the military budget to build his wall, number 3, right? Scapegoating in order to unify his base. But in the process of taking money out of the military, he's neglecting fundamental needs of the military, of military families. So it's hype as opposed to reality, right? Rampant sexism. This is one of the things, of course, that, that governments of authoritarian governments, tyrannies, tend to be almost exclusively male dominated. These days you might see a couple of token females. But under fascist regimes, traditional gender roles are made more rigid. Divorce, abortion, homosexuality are suppressed. And the state is represented as the ultimate guardian of the family institution. And this was one of the binding alliances between the evangelical movement and to some extent the right wing of the Catholic institutions and the right wing of the Republican Party as it exists now. And of course, when we look at the election of Donald Trump, who is a serial woman, abuser of women, rampant sexism is, it's overt. It's overt. Number 6 is controlled mass media. And it begins usually with the suppression of a free press. And the very first thing that was done with this administration was to demean the press, to start using the term fake news, and to begin to persuade his base that they could only receive truth and information from him, through him. And we happen to live in an era where he has his own microphone and his own means of communicating directly to his base. And he has Fox 5. In New York it's 5. He has Fox Media, which has become essentially state media. Roger Ailes is a whole conversation that we could have about the growth of the Fox Media empire and its role in helping to perpetuate the Republican one-party strategy and of getting Donald Trump elected and keeping him in power. I try to watch periodically. It's very difficult, but they give enough facts to appear to be giving facts, but never give the full story. And so people are getting cleansed information. They're not getting the truth. They're getting a massaged propaganda where he is airbrushed. His language is airbrushed. What he says is airbrushed. And people are getting essentially disinformation and propaganda. And it is controlled mass media. And it is... So sometimes it's directly controlled by government, but in other cases it's indirectly controlled by government regulation or by sympathetic media spokespeople and executives or entire stations in this case. And censorship is very common, and we've seen many examples of that where there are no press briefings or people, members of different agencies of the press are not permitted into press briefings. CNN is excluded or thrown out. The Washington Post is excluded or thrown out, etc. And these are all indicia of the establishment of tyrannical governments. Number 7 is obsession with national security, and fear is used as a motivational tool by the government over the base, over masses of people. And we see that this whole the terrorizing of people, right? And then it evaporates. Remember the hordes that were coming, that were marching on the southern border. And then all of a sudden it sort of disappears, right? Because there weren't any. And prior to that, of course, we had the Patriot Act and all of the fear that was drummed up around that. 8, religion and government are intertwined. And this was part of what had my teeth on edge in 2004 with this alliance between the evangelical right and the adoption of all of their social policies. And it's still going on today. And what is happening with Mitch McConnell and the judges that he refused to allow any federal judges to be appointed under Obama. And now they're ramming these judges, many of whom are completely unqualified, but who are extremely right-wing, onto the federal bench where they serve for life. 9, corporate powers protected the industrial and business aristocracy are the ones who put the government leaders into power, creating a mutually beneficial business and government relationship and power elite. And we see that happening with the elimination of all regulations. And I could talk about that at great length, but we don't have time. Labor power is suppressed. That began in the 1970s and is still going on. Now we've dropped from 30% unionized workforce and a very healthy middle class in this country to less than 10%, and this incredible disparity of wealth and struggling. Obsession with crime and punishment. People are given the police are given almost limitless power to enforce the laws. And we're starting to see that now with Bill Barr and the way in which the Justice Department is being turned into a very dangerous entity, which right now is focused on rewarding his friends, but is also simultaneously being used to target Trump's so-called enemies. It is probably one of the most dangerous abuses of power that's going on right now. People need to pay very careful attention to it. And rampant cronyism and corruption. Friends and associates who point each other to government positions and use governmental power and authority to protect their friends from accountability. And it's not uncommon for national resources and treasures to be appropriated or outright stolen by the leaders. And we see, the petty version of it is the 1/3 of his, right? 1/3, 100. What is it? 100. He spent 147 days playing golf at Mar-a-Lago and essentially looting the treasury to pay for those trips. It's just a small example of it. There'll be more. And fraudulent elections, which happened and which with Russian meddling, and which was the headline today that the Russians are meddling again, and that in the disclosure of that to the Intelligence Committee of the House, Trump then fired the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, and put a crony in there who has absolutely no intelligence experience, so that the House, which under law is required to have these briefings, will not be told what's going on. And what they were told were the ways in which Russia is already meddling with the 2020 election. There's a lot more to be said about that. In 2004, I was warning that those are the things to watch out for. And in 2020, I'm talking to you about all the ways in which we're seeing those things happen. So I want to just end with not end, but end that portion, that terrifying portion, is a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who led the U.S. into war against these Axis powers, against the fascist currents that were sweeping across the globe. And he wrote explicitly about fascism, but about tyranny. The first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. Ownership of government by an individual, by a small group, or by any other controlling private power. Democracy, my friends, is not a spectator sport. It requires constant attention, and it requires our participation. So the effects of this kind of tyranny and the effects of Donald Trump on most of the people I know, myself included, is to drive us all a bit mad. The stupidity of it, the venality of it, the visible cruelty of it, the incessant lying and distortion of truth. This is another characteristic that wasn't listed here, but is clearly one of the characteristics of fascism, of the perpetuation of propaganda and of lies and of distortion, the destruction of truth, of saying that, that there is no truth, or the truth is only what I tell you, which is, of course, what he tells his followers. You can only trust me to give you the truth. Don't read CNN. Listen to CNN. Don't read the newspapers. Listen just to me and to my mouthpiece on Fox. The destruction of truth is incredibly damaging to our souls and our psyches. We start to feel like we're losing our minds, right? But in fact, it becomes all the more important. It becomes exhausting to listen to the news, so you don't listen to it constantly. The trick is to not turn it off, but to listen selectively, to select the variety of sources, not just one, but a number of sources from which you can derive your perspective on what is going on, and to pay attention, and to do so on a daily basis if you can, even if just briefly, to find people that you trust, who have integrity and who are good journalists and good journalistic institutions, and to remain informed, because the truth is the great source of empowerment and encouragement and inspiration and guidance as you stand up to lies. So you have to be able to articulate the truth. And there's a whole other conversation about how we enter into discourse with people who are not receiving truth, who are just getting a constant source of propaganda and distortion, and psychological, and id stimulation. But the effects of tyranny are these feelings of disorientation as truth seems to disappear. And because we're running out of time, I'm going to go faster. The response to that is to pay attention to truth and to be able to articulate it yourself, and to do so, to speak up and to not be quiet. That's one reason I'm doing this with you tonight. I need to speak about this. It keeps me clear and it keeps me focused. And I'm able to see what it is that I need to address and what I need to act upon, and then how I need to act. It makes us feel disempowered. So the way in which we respond to disempowerment is to be politically active. One of the things that I'm planning to do, we have a congressman here, Zeldin, who is one of Trump's biggest supporters. And I live in a highly Republican district. This is, that's where I am, on the east end of Long Island. We did have a Democratic congressman. He's long gone. A lot of money was thrown into his Zeldin's campaign by the Koch brothers, and he managed to secure the seat. Well, we may not win, but I will be actively engaged in the local Democratic candidate in order to take back that seat. And if we're not successful, we will try again, and we will try again, and we will try again. So political activism and engaging with a community of mutual support becomes enormously important in the face of what seems to be an overwhelming community that is ready to obliterate your rights and ignore what you have to say, right? Robin, can't be covered in just 1 hour. Thank you for this helpful talk. I hope that you continue to address these issues in coming office hours. Thank you, Robin. And I will. So responding by activism. And if you live in a neighborhood where you don't feel comfortable putting a Democratic Party sign on your lawn, then you don't have to. You're welcome, David. Then you don't have to, but you do have to be active. You have to find a way in which you can be active, and that you're not active alone, that you are part of a network of mutual support and companionship. That becomes empowering, right? So you respond to the feeling of disempowerment with activism, with a commitment. Do it within the framework of your life. What's possible? Maybe it's just one phone call a week where you pick up and you call in your neighborhood on behalf of a candidate. Maybe it's that you meet on a weekly basis and you stuff the envelope and lick the stamp in the old-fashioned way that this was done. But you find the outlet for you that's appropriate to your life, and you fill that space with your activism and your commitment. And you begin to get your strength from acting with courage. One of the things I always tell people, that courage, you don't find your courage and then act. You act in the face of your fear, your anxiety. You act, and on the other side of that leap of faith, you find your courage, you find your strength, and you find the values to which you are deeply committed. So we just have a few more minutes. one of the things that's most important as we begin to re-engage, as we begin to participate as active citizens, not just in voting, but in protecting the voting system, in being active for candidates, in being active in our neighborhoods, is to remember not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. And when we remember that, we're able to act with love, we're able to act with compassion, we're able to act with a generosity of spirit, we're able to listen to those with whom we don't agree. We learn, one of the things that we're going to have to learn how to do is how to engage with those, right, who have vilified us, how we will have to overcome the lack of information that they have, and the fervor and the commitment and the fear that's actively stimulated and sustained and played to. This is one of the dynamics that Fox and fascists use. Forget Fox and friends. Fox and fascists use the dynamic of fear to stimulate their base. So how we deal with that is a very important question. Remind me, and I'll talk about one of the strategies that I've been trying to use and seems to be effective. In remembering what we're fighting for, we also remember how to remain connected to the thing that is most important to us. I'm always saying this, so I'm sort of summing up now and skipping over some things that I'll talk about the next time. And that is what I'm always saying, that the divine is literally a breath away. And it's hard when we're choking on our words, when we're choking on our fear, when we're choking on our rage and our anxiety, which is part of what is stimulated in us, to remember to stop and to breathe. The best advice I can give you is to get outside. Go outside, try to go once a day. Take a moment and ground. Feel yourself connected to the earth on which you're standing. Bring the energy up. Stand in bare feet if you can, and feel the energy of the earth beneath you, sustaining you and supporting you. And bring that energy up into you and spread it through your body and let it strengthen you. And breathe. Breathing slow and deep calms you. It quiets you. It stills the anxieties and the fear and all the stuff that they stimulate, right? In order to drive you crazy and distract you and keep you from engaging and paying attention. You turn it all off. No, you must pay attention. And the way that you keep your focus in the midst of all of the madness that is generated to distract you and to make you neurotic and crazy, you ground and you breathe. And in the breathing, you remember, you feel and you experience the connection that you have to the planet. That with each breath that is brought into your body, you're being given a gift of life by the green things that live with us. And when you exhale, you're returning it. And there is an intimate connection between you and the life of this planet. And the life of this planet is organized around a fundamental principle that all beings, when they're taking care of themselves, when they're eating and breathing and having fun and taking a poop and making love and sleeping, that in all ways, all things, all beings are at the same time making the world in which they live a better place for all life. That's the organizing principle of life on Mother Earth. Through breathing, through grounding, through other techniques, there are ways of connecting to that reality. And when you're connected to that, there is nothing more powerful than the power of Mother Earth when it is part of you, when you recognize yourself as part of it. So there's a source of constant strength and inspiration and guidance and love, generosity, abundance, compassion, benevolence. And that is the energy with which we approach this struggle for strength, for courage, for clarity, and for commitment as we fight against tyranny. I did not intend to be here in this time, but here I am. And here you are. And we are here for many reasons. The primary one is to return to right relationship with Mother Earth. But we have a battle that we're going to have to engage in. And it makes perfect sense because we're dealing with the forces at the top of the pyramid that has created the culture, the world in which humans have been living for several thousand years, which has destroyed the planet. And so now, it has reduced to its essential nature, which is fundamentally destructive and tyrannical. And it is our job to face that. And the way in which we face it is with the best of who we are. And the best of who we are is always present for us when our hearts are open and we're connected to it. So I send you out into the world, I hope, a little bit strengthened, with some real clarity about what you're facing, but with a real sense of your enormous capacities to transform it. These periods of tyrannical madness overtake the human species periodically. It is our shadow that remains unresolved until we return to right relationship. They were not characteristics of most indigenous cultures, but our own pagan ancestors were engaged in these kinds of massive patriarchal and violent undertakings. So we have a lot of work to do in becoming fully human and reconnected to the divine world in which we live. But I am quite confident that as we do that, we become the source of healing and of remediation. If we have to fight, we fight, but we fight for the right reasons and we fight in the right way, and we will win. Just as my parents won and generations before them won, as Robin Hood won and Aradia won, we too will win, because the arc of history may bend slowly, but it always bends towards justice. So I send you love and blessings, everyone, and I'll see you in a month. And thank you for the comments. They were great. They were really smart and helpful. Thanks, everybody. Blessed be, and I'll see you soon.